Disclaimer, this video is a response to a lot of the comments we've been getting on Reddit just saying that communism doesn't work, etc. So for context, you might want to watch the video that was previously uploaded on this channel. I guess? It kind of works on its own, but nah, whatever, fuck you. I get a chip on my shoulder when I see people like Digibro claiming that anime can be saved if enough YouTubers just communicate what they want from the industry to Netflix. He references the 80s being the best time for the industry because the economy was booming and producers could just throw around shit tons of money to finance niche projects. In this climate, it's easier to take a financial risk because the likelihood of your livelihood being on the line is far less of an issue. But we don't live in an economic boom anymore, so the incentivization for producers to make these kinds of shows is just not there. The risk-reward factor is too skewed. If you're an anime fan, whether you realize it or not, communism is important to you. We can make idealistic arguments about how the people who run these companies should change their tune for the good of the world, but do you really think people who grew up inheriting most of their wealth being surrounded by other equally prestigious people actually care about what's good for humanity? Many of these people have barely communicated with lower class people in a way that wasn't directly serving over them, because of course they haven't. Their entire life has been built around their own wealth. I mean, people literally have jobs taking care of money for their parents. Why would the majority of rich people have any perception of a greater good and doing things for a good cause? You're talking about the same people who bust unions of workers begging for enough money to live on while simultaneously supporting investment in other countries wherein they actively employ near slave labor conditions. You think the foreign government's gonna fix that shit? Nah, we own them too. And if we don't, let's get our buddies in the US government to have a coup.
But I do like movies. I love movies. And I know a lot of movies aren't popular. And you can say that going in. One of the reasons I retired is so I could make movies that aren't popular. Because in the world we live in the system we've created for ourselves in terms of it's a big industry, you cannot lose money. So the point is that you're forced to make a particular kind of movie. And I used to say this all the time when people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? I said, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want.
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism. And there's only certain, look, when I started in the 70s, it was like this. You know, I could say Russia was like this, but we were like this. You could do a certain kind of movie. And I flaunted that system. I mean, THX, my first film, is definitely not an American film, and I shoved it in sideways. Francis helped me trick the studio.
Yeah, right.
They would have never let me make that movie if they knew what I was doing.
Communism is not fundamentally a bad word. Even if you're not one of us, communists have legitimate critiques of capitalism, as I've outlined in the beginning of the video. The reason we demonize fascists without argument is because they are racist, and we understand racism is bad. Judging other individuals based on shallow attributes such as skin tone rather than character is bad. Communism, however, cannot be defined as simply as that, because to remove each individual facet of how the Soviet economy, or even the theory of Karl Marx itself, is to remove all nuance of another economic system, rather than using its arguments to challenge and better your own system. Why else did FDR implement public institutions? It's because his administration observed the tendencies of communist nations and implemented a middle ground between the two systems. But we would not have gotten the New Deal and other Keynesian expenditures that have continued to foster and save economies around the world without looking at that big scary word communism for all it meant. School isn't meant to teach you these nuances behind subjects like communism. We're told it was a horrendous dictatorship that killed millions of people. If we were to look at this in context, however, many of those millions died in famine due to the sheer amount of countries invading the Soviet Union. If you have the US and France invading you while supporting armies of your own people, food is not going to be plentiful. This is the country that literally came up with the scorched earth tactic. After the arduous struggle of the revolution, the Soviet economy began to skyrocket, being one of the only economies in the world consistently without bust, excluding a short period after World War II. Quote, "From the moment in 1928 that the Soviet economy became publicly owned and planned to the point in 1989 that the economy was pushed into a free market direction, the Soviet GDP per capita growth exceeded that of all other countries but Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. GDP per person grew by a factor of 5.2 compared to a 4.0 for Western Europe, and a 3.3 for the Western European offshoots, the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In other words, over the period in which its publicly owned planned economy was in place, the USSR's record in raising incomes was better than that of the major industrialized capitalist countries. The Soviet Union's robust growth over this period is all the more impressive considering that the period includes the war years, when a major assault by Nazi Germany left a trail of utter destruction in its wake. The German invaders destroyed nearly 1,500 cities and towns, along with 70,000 villages, 31,000 factories, and nearly 100 million head of livestock. Growth was highest in 1970, at which point expansion of the Soviet economy began to slow. However, during this so-called and misnamed post-1970 period of stagnation, GDP per capita grew 27%. While Soviet GDP per capita rates compare favorably with those of the major capitalist economies, a more relevant comparison is with the rest of the world. In 1928, the Soviet Union was still largely an agrarian country, and most of the people worked in agriculture, compared to a minority in Western Europe and North America. Hence, the economy of the USSR at that point of its transition to public ownership and planning was very different from that of the Western industrialized capitalist countries. On the other hand, the rest of the world resembled the Soviet Union in also being largely agrarian. It is therefore that the rest of the world, not the United States and other advanced industrialized countries with which the USSR should be compared. From 1928 to 1989, Soviet GDP per capita not only exceeded growth in rich countries, but exceeded growth in all other regions of the world combined, and to a greater degree. Hence, not only did the publicly owned planned economy of the Soviet Union outpace the economies of richer capitalist economies, it grew even faster than the economies of countries that were like the USSR in 1928. For example, outside its southern core, Latin America's GDP per capita was $1,332, almost equal to the USSR's $1,370. By 1998, the Latin American figure had reached $4,886, but the average income in the Soviet Union had climbed far higher to $7,078. Public ownership and planning had raised living standards to a higher level than capitalism had in Latin America, despite the equal starting point. Moreover, the Soviet peacetime economy unfailingly expanded. The Latin American economy grew in fits and starts, with enterprises regularly shutting their doors and laying off employees. Perhaps the best illustration of how public ownership and planning performed better at raising living standards comes from a comparison of incomes in Soviet Central Asia with those of neighboring countries in the Middle East and South Asia. In 1928, these were the areas in a pristinely pre-industrial state. Under public ownership and planning, incomes grew in Soviet Central Asia to 5,257 per annum. By 1989, 32% higher in neighboring capitalist country Turkey, 44% higher than in neighboring capitalist Iran, and 241% higher than in neighboring capitalist Pakistan. For Central Asians, it was clear on which side of the Soviet Union's border standards of living were highest. End of quote. Clearly, what we're led to believe that the Soviet system had not worked is wrong here. But what of democracy? Well, I think we should have the right to defend authoritarianism as a concept, as well as debate it, but even without that, the USSR was technically a democracy. I'm not going to get into how all that works, so just watch the video on the screen here about Soviet democracy by a great YouTuber named Trashevich Edelman. I don't actually know how to pronounce the name of his channel. Either way, watch it. So to those of you who are anime fans, detesting anime's need for a communist uprising, I must ask you, where do you want this medium to head to? Do you want the continual stagnation required of artists to meet the demands of markets and trickle down to intellectuals? Or do you want a thriving socialist economy in which every man who has the will to be an artist can make themselves an artist? Anime is not safe. None of your favorite media is. While the Soviet economy continued to innovate in the film industry with masterworks like Tarkovsky's Stalker, our capitalist countries can only continue pumping out more Eromanga senseis and CGI shitfests. The system needs to change, but it's up to us to do that. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. No, it's not. Dr. Seuss.